everyone. I'm never sure at which point to say hello, but as you're all filing in, welcome. This is our 564th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Michelle Segre and David Rhodes. We're thrilled to welcome poet Diana Rickard here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. Today's conversation will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can view the full archive of the series. And now I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest and host. In her sculptures of plaster, wire, mesh, found detritus, and various organic matter, Michelle Segre develops a heterogeneous vision informed as much by mega ancient Neolithic idols as by Joan Miró and science fiction. Segre has had solo exhibitions at institutions such as Cress Gallery, and she has been honored with the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and others. David Rhodes is an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail and has published reviews in Artforum, Art Critical, among many other publications. He has had paintings in the permanent collections of the Museum of Fine Arts and the Huntington Museum, Los Angeles. Thank you all so much for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, David.
Hi, Michelle. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's new social environment. Before we look at and speak about your current exhibition at Derek Eller, can I ask you about your process? Because I'm trying to imagine the kind of inventory of materials that you might have in your studio. Could you say something about how you accumulate and then construct the pieces that you have in this current exhibition? Could we have an installation view while we talk about this?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer questions about materials. So these two pieces that you're looking at here, the materials are, I use a solid core wire that's plastic coated, which is similar to, it is actually the kind of wires that are sold in hardware stores for electrical work. So it's a type of wire that holds its form. And I use that as a way to stretch the pieces of yarn. So it's not totally rigid, the wire, so it allows me to then kind of pull it and push it, manipulate it into these kind of slightly funky shapes, so they're not perfect geometrical forms. Mm-hmm. So that's what the yarns are stretched on, and then the piece on the right has electrical conduit tubing on the perimeter, which is rigid, but I bend that by hand into a shape. And the conduit gets attached by couplings. So it comes in like 10-foot lengths, and then I bend it and attach the pieces by couplings. So the whole piece can break down into parts. Mm-hmm. Some of the other, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask about the variety of materials that you use, some of which are perishable. Is that right? And you've often used material, organic material, like mushrooms or bread. Or can you say something about how that gets integrated with the wire and the thread? other materials that you're using?
Sure. Yeah, so I use, in these pieces, there's mushrooms that start out as fresh mushrooms, either foraged in the supermarket or or found in the woods, and I dry those out until they become very light. I dry them out usually just by tying them upside down for several weeks in an area that doesn't have a lot of moisture. So I've started incorporating these organic things. Like I've been working with that for a long time, like since the very earliest days when I was making sculpture, you know, like 100 years ago, I guess. No, I guess it would be in the 90s, right? I was experimenting with things back then, like mold and soil and all kinds of kind of weird, funky things. And then I also started around that time to make these large-scale beeswax pieces that were based on things that existed in the real world, like a wedge of cheese or a slice of bread. And I would collect the actual objects and dry them out and use them as models to work off of. So I had done a whole series of giant beeswax mushrooms that were loosely based on these mushrooms that I had dried, these shiitake and portobello, some other types of mushrooms. So those were like the models. And so I had in my studio for many years these models of bread slices and mushrooms. And I noticed that, you know, like they looked the same over like a 20-year span. So eventually I started to incorporate the actual dried elements into the work. So the piece on the right has dried mushrooms in it, and the piece on the left has lotus root, which has been sliced up and dried as well.
Do these organic elements have a particular significance in contrast to the kind of more urban materials? Is there a did this evolve naturally? Were you curious about the materials, and then as the sculptures themselves evolved over the years, you integrated them, or did you feel by using materials like mushrooms, bread, whatever, you were expanding the possibility for sculpture, and it didn't have to be permanent material. It could be literally perishable, temporal material.
Yeah, I mean, I was expanding my materials all over the place, you know. So so after I stopped working with the beeswax, I started using all kinds of different things, you know, and found objects and old test pieces that had been lying around my studio. And so it seemed kind of natural to also include these little organic elements that had actually played so much of a role in the subject matter that I was delving into, which is decay and you know, like decay being paired with rebirth and regeneration. So like so the two are kind of being examined together in a sense. And so I had this interest in fungus and mold and how that kingdom kind of contributes to the you know, to creating relationships of rebirth and regeneration.
Right, right.
So, and then the bread, you know, my interest in the bread, I had kind of come to that also through the fungus because of the yeast is a fungus. So then I started reading about different like ergot, which is this fungus that grows on wheat. And so I had done this whole series of giant bread slices that were meant to be like covered in mold, but they were made of beeswax. So there was a kind of circularity that occurred when I then years later started to use the actual bread slices and dry them and incorporate them into the sculptures.
There seems to be a strong connection between the pieces. You know, in the exhibition, we can see from this image that because of the porosity of each piece, we see another piece. So that there seems to be a communication between them. They seem to be of a kind and they share similar elements, even though I'm tempted to call them individual characters. You know, they have a presence of their own, but then they seem to communicate with each other. There seems to be like a family of objects. I read somewhere that you were very interested in a book about trees communicating.
Oh, yeah, I did read this book called The Hidden Life of Trees,
Right.
by the German forest, what do you call a person who studies forests again? I almost said forest ranger, but he's a little more than that. Anyway, I don't know if anyone, the book came out a few years ago and was really kind of mind-blowing, like just the way it described all this stuff that is happening underneath the ground, that you know, between trees, their ability to communicate with each other through their roots by using the mycelium as a kind of internet. So there's all this research now that, you know, has come out about this. So the mushrooms are kind of symbols of that kind of communication. You know, whether, you know, whether it's I feel like any kind of mushroom can kind of stand in for that, even a cultivated mushroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be a mushroom that's found in the woods.
I mean, just as a principle, an unexpected form of communication, the idea that trees and fungi can be codependent and make exchanges that are beneficial and adjustments given the situation they find in their environment is maybe as a sort of an allegorical fact. It can encourage a view of, say, that the objects you're making as having a potential to communicate or have a kind of discourse with the viewer that we don't usually think happening between an inanimate object and a human, but in fact, there's a lot gets communicated and exchanged when we look at art. So those are not only art. So with, you know, in the natural world or the built environment, there are all kinds of exchanges that we're less conscious of, but nevertheless impacting.
Yeah, I find that fascinating.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was thinking about, I think you were quoted as saying, because you have studios in the Bronx and in rural Massachusetts. Is that right?
Yes.
And the quote was about you stargazing, looking at stars and feeling there was some kind of potential for a communication there. So these sound very esoteric ideas, but that doesn't mean they're not hugely significant or actual or a part of the way we think and live in the world. So is one of the pieces is actually titled for that experience? Is that correct? I think you have a piece, Eight Body Chorus, is that right?
Eight Body Chorus is the piece on the left. So all the three large pieces, these two big ones and the other red one, they were made over about a 2-year span, where I was kind of going back and forth between the Bronx and rural Massachusetts. And at some point during that period was, you know, the whole pandemic thing. And so I stayed for an extended period of time in the country. It was about 5 months or so. And during that time, I became much more kind of in tune with stuff that was happening in the sky. I mean, in nature, with nature in general, but particularly the night sky was something that was a very powerful force. And so these pieces are kind of informed from that experience, the experience of like lying on your back and looking up at the sky and feeling like you're in this kind of 360-degree oval space that just goes on into infinity. And then, you know, I became more aware of like the spiral. It sounds really kind of so I don't know what exactly, hippie dippy or something, but this kind of spiral shape in the sky, and then the eye of the sky. It was something that I was feeling it very emotionally, you know, as well as visually, very visceral. It was very visceral. So it got into all three of these pieces. The Eight Body Chorus one maybe is the one that's the most connected to the actual feeling of that eye looking down. So there's I think because of the black, you know, the dark around the center.
I saw in John Yao's review of your exhibition a reference to you being very interested in the 17th century Kabbalist Robert Flood. Is there something very particular about Robert Flood's writings that relate to your the way you think about the objects you make? Is there something about his writings in particular?
I had used an image that I had come across, which was a diagram of the mind. And I can't remember what the source of it was. It was either this book that I have on alchemy. It's a Taschen book, a small book that it's all images. So there's no writing in there. It's just images and diagrams from different time periods, but a lot of it is like 16th and 15th century. So it might have come from that book, and I had used it in this giant wall installation that I did of drawings and notes and references that I had collected. And so I had done this like, and he saw that a few years ago, and he wrote about it at the time. I think it was, I don't remember what year. It was a while ago, like maybe 2014, I think.
Uh-huh.
So I think that's what he's referring to there. So it wasn't so much writings, it was just this image.
But this is a particular interest of yours, alchemy. Are you very interested in that as a subject? I mean, in a kind of broad way, in the sense that the creation of objects from disparate materials is a kind of alchemy. I don't mean in a particularly, narrow way, but in the broad sense, art is a kind of alchemy.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I have this kind of devotion to materials that tend to be very kind of very, very accessible, like just there's nothing particularly fancy about these materials. They're very easy to access. It's canvas, it's muslin, it's string, wire, yarn, conduit. So there is definitely this kind of alchemist approach, turning this kind of detritus into these objects that then have this kind of power or energy to them, is a form of alchemy, I suppose.
Yeah. A few years back, I spoke to somebody who's very close to Fred Sandback, and he apparently really valued the fact that he could buy very inexpensive wool thread by the bundle, put it in a suitcase, travel, say, to Europe, and then with that thread, create pieces that occupied an entire museum. So, again, as you're saying, very humble, inexpensive material used to make museum scale sculptures that occupied a very large space. And I think in an interview I saw with you, you were talking about creating forms from dense materials.
From what?
Dense materials. So, but when you came to use yarn, you could increase the scale without, it was the way you could extend the scale of the objects you were making without having to deal with the mass of objects that are very cumbersome. I mean, it gave you a freedom, or which led to these very porous objects, kind of tensile, membrane-like objects.
Yeah, Fred Sandback is a great reference. It's funny because I was, that someone was asking me like about the use of the yarn, and I was talking about how when I first started working with wire and string, I started to notice how there's this power that lines have, you know, where you can create a relationship between spaces. If you stretch a piece of yarn from, or a piece of string from the ceiling to the floor, you're immediately creating this relationship between the floor and the ceiling. And so all the area around it becomes activated and energized. And then I said, you know, look at the work of Fred Sandbeck, who literally made a whole, you know, incredible body of work, lifetime's work around that idea. But for me, it was very liberating because I had been sort of weighed down with materials that occupied a lot of space and were heavy, and so it became a way for me to kind of capture space and enter, have the objects enter the space around them, and to create a kind of scale that that goes beyond the borders of the piece.
Right. I mean, while we're on the subject of other artists, there seems to be a connection between these pieces and the later works of Lee Bontekoe. I think you must like those very much.
Oh, I love Lee Bontekoe. Definitely one of my favorite artists.
I mean, it's
and
very
I love the late work.
Yeah, the late work. Yeah, I mean, it's a very nice dialogue there between her late work and these current works of yours, I think. And
yeah, I hope so.
I was also wondering, because there's also kind of two-dimensionality to the works. You know, they are a little like webs, and they're porous, as we said. But they, I was wondering if you use or you make drawings as you evolve the pieces, because they recall in a way some painters' works, maybe like Joanne Greenbaum. There's a certain, you know, affinity perhaps with Joanne's work, and she's, you know, a painter who moves out into 3 dimensions with her ceramics, and you work in a 3-dimensional way, but you acknowledge a kind of a plane, or there's a space for an image. It's even when your pieces are anchored by very volumetric elements, they have a very strong, like a frontal, or not exactly a confrontation, but they face the viewer. You know, it's a case of walking around and wondering about how the form evolves. In that sense, they're very immediate in the way that certain images are, even though they exist on different levels because of their complexity and the tactile nature of the component parts, and because they're so detailed and the drawing is very complex. So I was wondering, do you work 2-dimensionally as well? Or?
So I never sketch out a piece and then create a piece based on that sketch. But I do often make drawings that come like either halfway, you know, through the process, or after the piece is already created. I will make very kind of informal drawings of those, just to play around with the forms and stuff. But really the pieces kind of come together in different ways. Like sometimes I'll have some fragments that I'll have started, and then I just start playing around with those fragments and putting things together, taking away, putting together, taking away. So it tends to be fairly improvisational in that way. And Joanne Greenbaum is an artist I greatly admire. So I'm not surprised you see affinity with our work. Yeah, I love her work. So I think her work is also very improvisational. So and she has a very kind of bold use of color that I definitely connect with.
Yeah. How do you think about color? I mean, how does the color develop in your pieces? Are you drawn towards this particular range of color, the brightness of the color, the way in which it shapes the forms that you already have? Or
yeah, the color is like, I mean, I use color to achieve like certain levels of fastness and slowness, if that makes sense. Like I think of it as kind of like an electrical force, where colors are playing off of each other and in creating a kind of buzzing, you know, a kind of back and forth, you know, like in this piece, I didn't try out any colors ahead of time. I kind of feel it out, you know. I put one color in and then I react to that color with another color. And so there tends to be like this kind of back and forth all the time with, you know, dark to light, bright to earthy, the contrasts, playing off of those contrasts. The center of this piece, the yellow, was originally, the blue was not in there. So it was just like a big yellow blob. And I kind of let that sit for a really long time, like many weeks. And then one day I just like stuck this paint skin of blue right in the center. And it was immediately like, you know, like going back to like my Cooper Union Albers class where we experimented with color, complementary colors and all that. You know, like, so if you stare at the center of this piece, I don't think it'll work on the screen, but if you see this piece in person, if you stare at the center and then look away onto a white wall, you'll see yellow in the center and blue on the outside.
I guess if Albers was a tantric artist, he may have gone in your direction. Yeah. Can you say something about this particular piece, about how do you think about the open structures in relation to the base you have? And the base seems very much, of course, it's a part of the sculpture, but there's a playfulness. You know, some of your sculptures don't need a base, so you use the base as almost like a quotation. It's sculpture has a base, but in the way you work doesn't need to, so it can come in and out as an element, and you improvise. You know, you work with the base as an integral part of the sculpture.
Yeah, definitely. I consider the base to be part of the piece. Like, so it's not an afterthought. It's kind of made along with the piece. You know, and then also it's obviously creating giving the gravity to allow the piece to stand through the weight, which for me is like one of the most satisfying points of making the sculptures, the ones that are freestanding, like just getting them to stand, you know, like that's like the most exciting point where where the thing is finally, like this giant thing, you know, is finally not falling over. It's a little different in some of the smaller ones where the bases become proportionally like more important to the, like especially in this work, like you know, the base, like proportionally the base is actually bigger than on some of the big ones that I have, some of the much bigger pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also gives like a point of opaqueness that relates to the meteor type thing that's floating in the hole. So you have like this porousness, and then you have the, you know, the skinny and the bulbous.
And the pieces always have a kind of character that they seem to be participating. You know, when one is with them, it's like being in the. It's not a. It's almost like they look back, or they have an attitude, or they're characters. They have a characteristics that aren't so much not only formal, you know, in their playfulness, but they always seem to have a, you know, there's the feeling they look back. You know, when you look at them, they're not passive.
They look back at you. Yeah.
They, you know, if I think about someone like Miró, you know, who moved between painting, sculptures, and he made designs for theatre and also textiles. There's that movement between well, the idea that the inanimate has a character too, and that through materiality things can be manifest, and this includes anthropomorphic type shapes, but not only, because materials can communicate a feeling or a spiritual aspect. It's difficult not to be affected, you know, in the presence of a piece like this that's been created out of, like you're saying, otherwise humble materials that might go unnoticed or might not seem to have any potential outside of a simple practical use, but actually once they're recontextualized and you've worked with them, their potential is released. You know, what they can do as a color, shape, form, then their material presence is transformed.
I mean, ultimately, do you think it's the materials are a way to channel the subconscious, right? Like we're channeling the subconscious through our use of materials, and materials are communicating something that is coming from us. So that sense of a being or whatever, I mean, it is, yeah, it's an extension of being.
Can we look at an image of another piece? Great. Could I ask you about this piece? I mean, it seems it's playful, and it's is there a humor to this piece? Do you think it?
I was definitely wondering if it was possible for me to make a pink piece that was not going to be just totally horrifying to look at. So it was kind of, it started out as an experiment because I just really loved this particular wool yarn that I had, the one that's draping down. And so it started out like I just wanted to do it as a challenge to myself to see if I could make something that was only pink,
Right.
that would not be obnoxiously saccharine or something, you know. So I did it, and I ended up liking it.
Yeah.
It has 2 small bread balls hanging. Those are those 2 tiny little balls. And it has a kind of an eye also, you know, an eye reference here. So I kept thinking about like a sty, like pink eye.
What happens to these perishable elements over time? If the sculpture is with a collector, do they need replacing? Or I think you said the mushrooms don't change so much, but are there elements that their life is the length of the duration of an exhibition, and then they need replacing? Or
well, oddly, the bread is also like just it's almost like a fossil or something. It just seems to, unless it's dropped on the floor, in which case it might shatter. I've noticed that the bread is pretty resilient. But of course, you know, it's not going to be like a bronze statue. It's bread. But I did, like, when I first started using the bread, I started to become more aware of it out in the world. And I came across pieces of bread that were preserved in the museum in the Egyptian wing at the Met from thousands of years ago. So then I researched a little more and found there was a loaf that's in the British Museum that's 3,000 years old. There were most recently crumbs that were found around an ancient fire site where food had been cooked, that are something like, oh man, I'm probably gonna get the date totally wrong. It was found in Jordan, and it was dated to pre-agricultural times. So it was when humans were still hunter-gatherers and foragers. So they were moving, and then every once in a while they would stay a little longer in one location and have a feast. And so these breadcrumbs that were found in the fire were something like 30,000 years old. Is that possible? Did I remember that correctly? I'm sure someone out there knows this story because it was in the news a few years ago. So they now know that that bread was something that was made before agricultural settlements.
Yeah, interesting. So that's a different.
So I'm not saying my pieces are going to last 30,000 years, but just just to throw it out there.
The perishable elements might, though. I mean, maybe all the other synthetic elements will disappear, but the bread will still be.
Probably, yeah.
Well, great thought. Can we see? Oh, right. Wow.
So this,
Hmm.
this one, I still have to come up with titles for these. They're a bit new and I meant to title them. So title to come.
And this one is able to move, is that right? This can.
The center blob thing will turn if it's windy. Yeah, it's just hanging there. And this is kind of like just something that got crunched up in the studio with it was something I'd been working on for a really long time that I ended up squishing in all kinds of different ways and then adding little things to it, and it became this tangled mess, and then it ends up being a piece kind of almost by accident.
So sometimes in the studio, pieces can evolve without you necessarily, well, you don't have a plan for them. They kind of evolve and then find a place eventually.
Yes, that happens a lot. I never throw anything away. I don't give up on pieces. I just put them aside, and then I have found that more often than not, they will make their way back somehow and enter a new work.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Yeah, that was.
I was wondering if there's a big difference working in Massachusetts than working in the Bronx. I was wondering if the kind of materials that are available or the amount of space maybe you have to work. I don't know if you work out of doors.
I do. I work out of doors in the summer for certain things, like, and then in Massachusetts, I have the ability to take a large work out of the room into outside to, if I need to look at something that doesn't quite stand up in the space. Like the big black one, I don't have ceilings that are high enough either in the Bronx or in Massachusetts. So I was able to take it outside in Massachusetts to see what it looked like if it was raised up higher.
Do you have a part of your studio that you can, as we're seeing in this image, you can appreciate the linearity of the piece because there's a blank wall behind. But if I'm imagining you working in your studio and there's an assortment of materials and partially finished works that form a background to the piece being made, do you have an area where you can isolate the sculpture to see, or is it kind of it's a surprise when the works are in a gallery and you can see them, isolated from the materials that they are accumulated from?
It is always a surprise because both my studios are not that large, and they're especially the one in the Bronx, there's a lot of stuff, because I've been doing this how many decades now, I don't know. So it's kind of like being in a giant spider web with all this stuff clumped in it. That's what my studio feels like at times. Right now it's not so crowded because I have the work up in the gallery. But yeah, usually to really see a piece, I have to put it up. I have to put one up at a time. So I'll work on a lot of different things at the same time, but they'll be like on the floor or not fully assembled or on the tabletop. They'll be like in different parts of the space. One will be hanging, but then to really see it, I need to devote one area of one wall that I can do that on.
Yeah. And how did you come to be based in New York? I mean, what's the story of, because you've been in New York a long time, and...
Yeah, I've lived in New York since I was 5.
Oh, well, that's a long time.
Yeah.
So you didn't go to school, you were here already.
I was here already. I grew up in New York, went to all the public schools here, then ended up in Cooper Union.
Right.
So stayed here for art school as well.
Right.
And I've never really lived anywhere else. I was born in Israel, but moved with my family to New York City when I was 5.
Right. And who was, were there any important teachers at Cooper Union? Was that a very important moment for you, the time spent at the school?
Yeah, it was great. I thought of myself as a painter then. Gary Steffen was a great teacher who I studied with for a couple of years, I guess. I didn't really do much sculpture though, so that kind of came later, after school.
Yeah.
I didn't go to graduate school. I just kind of found a studio right away, leaving Cooper Union, and pretty much had it with school by then, and just had no interest in going to graduate school. So yeah, and then I started working with, I was making paintings, and I started working with more and more 3-dimensional materials on the canvases. And then eventually those materials started to make their way to the floor. And
Is that the kind of, that was the transition you were working, you've been thinking in terms of painting initially.
Yeah.
And then because of the materials you were adding to the painting was coming out into space, and eventually it didn't make sense to think in simple two-dimensionality or illusionistic space when you could, you felt more at home working in actual space, because the materials kind of needed that room. Or,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and I felt somehow that I could do more exciting things making sculpture. So I became more drawn to it just as a territory that seemed to me like more wide open with possibilities. We're talking time-wise, it was like, I left Cooper Union in 1987. So, late 80s, early 90s. It felt like sculpture was like painting had been, I don't know, there were all these like superstars out there in the painting world. It just seemed like sculpture was more kind of unknown territory, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, if we think
and I just want to say that was a big mistake. Going down that path. Wow. What was I thinking?
If we think of a lot of American sculpture, it's of what's described as minimalist, the minimalist type, it's relatively puritanical in its use of material and form. If one thinks of Brazilian artists, say Brazilian modernists, they don't have that kind of restraint. So work like yours, or we could talk about Lee Bonteque or many others, really, Eva Hesse, this really expanded the field of sculpture, not in a kind of, as I said, a puritanical way, but the introduction of so much new material, and not just a material, but many that could be combined in almost in well, certainly unforeseen. The use material in sculpture was suddenly like that available to painting. You know, the different open-ended ways in which painting can be made with imagery and material and whatever color and mark. And there's so many different directions and philosophies for painting. But what you seem to be saying is you were participating in making sculpture, but in a way that seemed to have, you know, territory that was completely ignored or unexplored. So there was a freedom to take whatever materials or forms that you wanted to take, and it wasn't as if you were being crowded by these, you know, star artists who were taking up all the air. Maybe there was more opportunity, more scope in sculpture. Did it feel like a kind of a leap in the dark as well? Sorry, did it feel like you were because of the unknown aspect of this? You know, I'm thinking of somebody like Nikita Sandfal, or there are sculptors that made work that there's not 10 Nikita Sandfals. You know, they stand out as like Giacometti. There are singular voices that aren't one of, you know, many working at this, you know, a similar idea. So it's a bit like a leap in the dark, that you're making things you can't account for by saying, oh, well, it's very similar to this. It's a few degrees different. You are actually going into a way of making that didn't have so many precedents.
It doesn't have historical heaviness, you know. It's I mean, if you look at the history of sculpture, like what really changed about sculpture since ancient times, you know, in the Western world anyway. You know, there's stone carvings, there's marble, there's cast bronze, clay, and then, you know, you have like hundreds of years of this. And then you have Rodin, you know, it's like the first like modern sculptor. And then someone like Medardo Rosso, who was, you know, inspired by Rodin, but then materially started to be very experimental, you know, using the wax and the plaster. So really not until the 20th century do you see other materials, and we're speaking only of Western here, because other, you know, obviously in other parts of the world there wasn't that kind of approach at all. So I think just historically sculpture, and then by the 1980s, you know, it was there were a lot of women in particular who had been doing really interesting things with materials and stuff. And so I think like Eva Hess was definitely a big influence on me when I was younger. And
Interesting.
Louise Bourgeois and Jackie Windsor, Kiki Smith, and Lee Bonteque, who you mentioned before.
Yeah. Michelle, I think this is a good moment to open up the conversation to our audience, and let's see what kind of questions people have for you. This will be very interesting.
Yes, thank you both so much. It's been really, really fascinating. We have a lot of questions. I'd love to turn it over to our friend GE. Would be able to unmute.
Thank you so very much. I love this work. It just does so much. Is your art perhaps an extension of we talked a little bit about it earlier, of the tantric? Is your art perhaps a kind of extension of the tantric ideal of divine perception, which is never to see actions and objects as mundane, but always spirited vehicles to activate us?
I mean, I would say that, I mean, I think of the sculpture as a kind of transmitter, you know. So in that sense, yeah, I would say it's definitely connected to that idea, the tantric.
Well, I also see it as a transmitter and a receiver at the same time too, because of our interactions with them. So that's what it was like.
Yeah,
like a wonderful antenna, you know, of radio antenna going out to space, you know, kind of a thing. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's about that relationship, the transmitter receiver, the back and forth between viewer and object, which is something, I mean, I don't feel like that's unique to my work just because I'm consciously talking about it, but I feel like when I have an experience with a work of art that moves me in some way, it's the same thing is happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. GE, next, I would love to turn it over to Lynn. You can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. Great question, GE. And thank you so much, David, for that great, and Michelle, it was a great conversation. I have a question about your relationships with your materials, because at first I had this feeling you were sort of tending to them, but then it seemed really wrong-footed of me because there was a reciprocity that seemed to be taking place. I haven't seen the work in person, but it just seems like there was this back and forth and reciprocal connection between them and you. I'm not sure if that's true, but then I was a little thrown when I saw a title called I Talk to Trees. And I thought maybe I was wrong. Talk to the tree as opposed to with the tree. So I was wondering about reciprocity and what that meant, and how much is you doing an action and how much is it the blending?
So I'm not sure I totally understand the question, like how much.
Well, the title, I Talk to the Tree.
Yeah.
Is you intervening with the tree. It's
rather
not,
than a tree talking to me.
We're talking together. I
got it. Okay,
because your work seems to me so about width.
Yeah, so it's a really it's a little bit of a silly response that I have. So I Talk to the Trees is actually the title of a song that I wrote. And in that song, the trees are also talking to me. So there is a reciprocal thing that is happening, but I only used that sentence from the song, just because I kind of like the idea of someone, you know, talking to trees. Like, you don't know, like, are they crazy, or why are they talking to the trees?
Yeah.
But actually it's because the trees are talking to you, that, you know, so it is in the song, it's a reciprocal thing. But
I got it.
The next line in the song was, and they talk to me.
Oh, okay. It's really an interesting critique of hierarchy, how you give value and meaning and action to these, you know, not necessarily precious objects that you work with.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that question. Next, I would love to turn it over to Richard Essex. You should be able to unmute.
Yes, hi. No, I was very impressed by some drawings I saw that you used to do quite a long time ago, Michelle. I'm not sure when, and I'm just wondering if you still draw for the sake of drawing. You mentioned in your talk that you do it as in kind of response to the sculptures you're making, but do you still draw just for drawing? And if that's the case, what's your approach to drawing?
So I think the drawings that you're referring to are the networky ones, right? I used to make these very intricate drawings of cells and networks and cells. They were kind of referencing landscapes, but with rocks in them. But they were very, like, they were made very stream of consciousness. Like, I would just kind of let my hand rove on the page, and they would take weeks to make. They were very, very detailed. So I stopped making those particular drawings when I began to work with the strings and yarns and wires, because it felt very much like I was doing a similar kind of action. It was like a behavior, it was more of a behavior than what was the other thing? I'm losing my word here. So when I started to make them as sculptures, I didn't feel the pressing need to make the drawings anymore, if that makes sense, because it was so much more satisfying to work with the materials, and I could work very, it wasn't labor intensive. I could create things very quickly with those materials. So I stopped making those particular drawings, and now the drawings I make tend to be, they're different. They're like more kind of like sketches. They're not like separate things. They're more related to the sculpture. Does that answer your question? Richard? I think we lost him.
He got muted, but yeah, thank you so much for that answer. Awesome. Oh, he says yes in the chat.
Okay.
Wonderful. Next, I would love to turn it over to Joan. Get you unmuted here. You should be able to unmute Joan and ask the question.
Oh, yes, thank you. It's wonderful, Michelle. I love your work. I don't know you, but it's had quite an impact on me. I love what somebody said about it being relating it somehow to antenna. Here, I'm going to actually appear. But I have this feeling that they're like these incredibly ecstatic, sort of celebratory emblems that I had this image of people sort of carrying them in a very joyous parade, maybe even that has a sort of religious or spiritual inflection to the parade. And I just wonder if that way of seeing them resonates with you at all, or is any part of your feeling about them. It's fine if it's not.
I feel like they have a spiritual presence that's maybe, more kind of pagan. So not religious, but spiritual, yes.
And very joyous too. There's something about your choices of color are so flamboyant and really, really out there.
Thank you.
Celebration of wildness.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Carolyn, I don't think your audio is coming through. Just want to try. Sorry, actually we can't hear you. Maybe try putting on headphones.
Okay.
Oh, no, we hear you now. Okay.
You're back.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe the spiritual and the pagan, something got in there. If you don't mind, I had just a brief sort of follow-up to Joan's question. I also see your work as so joyous, and how you are redefining what is inanimate. These are animate to me. And so I do find the work to be transformative. And I wonder though, if you find it to be diagnostic of anything at all, not to make it darker perhaps, but I wonder if you are critiquing or kind of diagnosing some sort of problem. I see you lifting us out of one and maybe transforming us, but I wonder if there's a diagnosis in there.
I mean, maybe in the sense that they're, some of the spirit of the work is this idea of this interconnectedness, of all like living things. So in that sense, like I feel like maybe the work is trying to act as a kind of last hurrah to this like, let's not forget how important that connection is, because really as a species, humans are not doing very well right now, I think. So yeah, I guess in that sense it would be diagnostic.
Well, yeah, sculptures living on beyond, that's for sure. So.
What?
Sculptures as living on beyond us, beyond humanity.
Yeah, you're cutting out.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. You know what?
It's okay.
Fan Bui to ask our last and final question. Take it away, Fan.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great show, Michelle. Great conversation with David. Yeah, it's one of the best show in town for sure. And I like Joan's remark, celebration of wildness, and Lynn reciprocal talking to or with the tree. And the last thing I came into my mind is that you just let it go. no preparatory drawing to the sculpture, but rather than surrender to the process and the materiality. It's terrific. Mike, I have two quick questions. One is that you mentioned Peter Wohlleben's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, which I also read. It's a terrific book, which brought up also in my interview with E.J. Hauser.
Oh,
At their, you know, at the gallery, same gallery as yours. And but I want to ask you whether you have read the other book by our new friend Suzanne Simers, Finding the Mother Tree.
no, let me write it down.
Terrific. All right, so I will send you a link for that we in our conversation with Suzanne. So the question, the other question is that, you know, you mentioned Miró in reference to, in a way, psychedelic. His biographer, Roland Penrose, claimed that he began to hallucinate, not because of drugs, but because of hunger. I'm not so sure I agree.
What?
I know. But I did once curate a show at, you know, Red Bull Studio on the subject psychedelic art. Somehow, as you know, it's coined by the British psychologist Humphrey Austin. So we talk about that, how it's related to what movement in the 60s, counterculture, mostly in rock music, more so than in art in some way, but that's not quite true either. We learned that even among our friends, some are now very much involved in that, you know, that psychedelic culture. But so my question is very simple. Have you ever experienced or taken any kind of psychedelic substance in order to give yourself a little freedom to do what you do in the
I have, but very infrequently. But I find it to be, I mean, I think it's an important experience. Like I would count it as like, you know, one of the top experiences, you know, but very infrequently, like just a few times, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's
and maybe that's why I feel like it's very special, because it's so rare.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it. That's my very simple question. Go see the show, you guys, before it ends. It's a terrific show. You got to be there in the front of the work to experience what Michelle's object is about. So thank you again, Michelle, David. Back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fang. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right.
I'm writing the name of the book down.
Yeah.
Finding
got the
Mother.
best recommendations.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for the conversation and these questions. Dying to see the show in person. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and today I'm so thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Diana Rickard, to the stage. Poet and sociologist Diana Rickard is an associate professor at Borough Manhattan Community College. She has a book on wrongful conviction and documentary coming out with NYU Press in 2023. As a poet, her recent body of work grapples with ways of navigating or failing to navigate consumer culture, late-stage capitalism, pop culture, and the general falling apart of civilization. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you, Diana. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for putting together this wonderful conversation. And also the slideshow was really effective for me. Like, I felt like I was able to look at the art like more deeply, but it also kind of kept expanding, you know. So this was such a great event, and I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to read 3 poems. The last one is up on the Rail right now, but the first 2 are not. Okay. When you lounge in the place I have shown you, my pen is a bug upside down. A jerky movement is a movement, like all movement or gesture, perhaps. I write of tin cans. I eat colors, and they are so marvelous. 10 toes tickling tentacles. See what I mean? If someone tells you to grow up, place a dime on your knee and count backwards from 1. It's okay to be right all the time. There are deer in everyone's headlights. There are smells on the barred horizon. A TV show is like a cigarette, is like a rodeo, is like a chipped dish, is like you, is like me, and we all scream. It's a miracle. It happens every day. When there is a memory, there is a lapse of snow melt on the windowsill. Will your driver fall from grace or your mosquito bury your nerves? I exhale a spray of carnations, and there are too many birds on my walls. When you go quack, I listen. It's like a bell in my chest, a book in the oven. A torso burns through the whole night of belly embers. Let's praise our irritabilities, our inner shandas. Let's carry the field in our enigmatic half-smirk smile. It's not too late to be late to the party. If someone tells you to do one thing, you can freeze up in fear. You can do another. You can twirl like a hero in a stream, streaming through a diamond colander, all your coolness a blinding shine, because you are the hero, hot in the pink blue snow. And then this one is called Fine Hairs on My Skin. Oh, I never really introduced poems, but Michelle, when you were talking about mold, it's so funny. This poem starts, that artist who beads moldy fruit, Kathleen Ryan, I think, or Catherine Ryan. I just wanted to say, when you were talking about that, I was like, oh, that idea is in my poem. Fine hairs on my skin. The artist who beads decayed fruit makes wondrous beauty. The way beauty rises, its steam, more than to be beheld, to be held. I believe in my underground tether. I nurture her. She holds the worst thing I've done that lurks quietly alive like a serpent in my warm belly. Don't let go of that worst deed. Let it be held. I am attuned to changes in light, to the hot gurgles and flips of my gut health and home fragrance, lilies and bergamot, waft of Mademoiselle. Nothing circulates nothing in the occluding fizz of air, what Lorca called the architecture of frost. Motor of my heart, hearty and generous, full figure aglow, and I love everything, my pouring into now. Michael McClure said foam, foam. I won't forget to work on my sentence structures, my glutes, my box of insights that glistens when excavated. My beliefs still don't dissolve. I am the crack in everything. I am the crack in everything. Blues that settle over the view like a diagram of the central nervous system, a gaze scarcely moving, reptilianly still. I once bought coffee mugs in London. I posed for a picture with giant painted eggs. I was somewhere, tropes of limited design, last year's disasters, cornflakes and fluff, an insipid kind of moonlight. The physical fact of a book has a specific sensuality. I browsed kaleidoscopes and was disappointed because of all the gaping poemlessness. To repeat phrases is to create motif. I remember 30 years, a thorny business, foxy jeans, the you that I inhabit comfortably, plausibly, hopefully. I want to rekindle the social world, but my coastline is solitude. I want to bathe in fresh confetti, crash through vulgarly the catastrophe of diminishing desire. I keep telling you I am here. I'm sure of it. What isn't filmed continues to breathe. I am ripe for its dressing. I populate my lines. I eat pepper and lavender cheese, live expectantly, pause for language. I leave my home with traces of presence, some imprint on the fine web of all of it. Oh, bring me something. I want something. I look forward to every word. And then this one is one of the poems in the May issue of the Rail. My popular culture. Pigeons are the noise of sinuses. beings, both real and imagined, android or raw, find consciousness through suffering, and obviously vice versa. This is why, quote, true art is not to be found in the dustbins and leftovers of burlesque or civic parades, no matter how frighteningly warm it gets this or any February. One day I heard about a torso found in a shopping cart and the startling realism of contemporary animation. Laying back down in bed, I asked myself, how can there be causation without representation? And think that every one of us is our own kind of Pangea, although I can't explain what that means. Why does my own congestion feel like the mere performance of anti-fascism? Why is the criminology of android drama so hard to decipher? Meanwhile, a sink burps and gurgles from its complex, ominous depths, a coda to the ends of autoethnography, reminding me that no one at work can laugh that real good, hearty laugh. I dream I survived an electric blue zombie herd, wake so disoriented I forget the geography of daily ablutions, forget that once I hope to find a treatise on who exactly is at risk and what we can do to attend this risk. I discovered too much too late in life, never ate the perfect fried pickle, did not watch that really important show, the one where character is finally disclosed and catastrophe averted in spite of the profit stream. Never have I ever touched the precarious transmitter, reached in and torn it down. Thank you so much for listening and for having me.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was such a beautiful way to extend today's conversation. Thank you again, Michelle and David, so very much. We would also like to thank everyone from Derek Eller for helping with today's program. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our operations here at the Rail. And please join us Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Raul de Nieves and Bill Corbin on the event of his show, of Raul's show at Company Gallery. And we will conclude with a poetry reading by Khor Ahmed. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Fong.
Congratulations on a beautiful, important show.
Thank you so much.
So great. It's terrific.
It was so much, it was really fun being invited here too. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, can't wait to put it out to the world, to our YouTube channel. Thank you for the reading too. Beautiful reading, Diana. It's so great. And hello, Umberto. From Italy. Would you believe it? We have friends from Italy, one tuning in from France. It's great. Well, congratulations. Go see the show, you all.
Yes.
And thank you. Great to see you all. Keep up the great work, love and courage, and see you super soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Well,
Thank you.
Congrats. Stay safe.